Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us today on a beautiful Saturday morning here in Houston. We're going to discuss or have a brief historical look at Glenwood's connection with the oil patch. My name is Dick Ambrus, and I am the proud Executive Director of Glenwood Cemetery. Today, we are pleased to partner with Preservation Houston to bring you this summer series. But before we begin, I would like to share with you some other thoughts regarding Glenwood. This year, 2021, is a very exciting year for us in that we experienced our 150 years of existence and growth and preservation in Houston. We have bold plans for the next 150 years, and as part of our vision, we look forward to welcoming you soon to our new home, the Center for Glenwood. You can see that on your screen. That's a beautiful layout. And we are going to be moving our entryway down about 60 feet on Washington Avenue to the east to make the entry more expansive. And we are also going to try to take the utilities down in front of the cemetery, which will further enhance the appearance. About 5 years ago, our board charged a building committee to address the vision and needs of Glenwood for the future. And through this planning process, the board agreed to move forward with a new center that would be the primary gathering place for families and friends of Glenwood, and as well as a resource for the community. This center will be a space strategically placed at the entrance of Glenwood to host educational seminars, conduct historical and horticultural research, and serve as an archive for some of Houston's most notable people. We are pleased that the community has funded over $10.8 million toward our $15 million goal to build the center. And this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to directly help fund a transformational project for Glenwood, and we invite you to reach out for us for more details. I look forward to sharing more about our new center later, but for now, I want to turn the program over to Jim Parsons, Program Director for Preservation Houston. Jim is no stranger to Glenwood Cemetery. He has developed and given approximately 300 tours in the past 20 years, and he is uniquely qualified to share Glenwood's historical past with us. Jim, program's all yours right now.
Okay, well, thank you, Dick. We sure appreciate the opportunity to take a deeper dive into some aspects of Glenwood's history. It's one of my favorite places in Houston and one of my favorite places to talk about. So I'm glad we've been able to do this, and thanks to the staff at Glenwood for coming up with this idea and inviting us into this partnership. And of course, we're happy that all of you have chosen to spend part of what is a really beautiful Saturday morning with us online. So I hope when this program's over, everybody's going to go outside and enjoy fall. I want to start off today with a little bit of Glenwood history. The cemetery was established in 1871, and it had its first burial in the summer of 1872. And Glenwood was the first rural garden cemetery in Texas, which means it was laid out along the lines of cemeteries that started appearing in Europe in the early 19th century, with park-like grounds, wooded settings, and locations that were outside of city centers. When Glenwood was established in 1871, it was on the edge of development in Houston. This rural cemetery or garden cemetery movement jumped from Europe across the Atlantic to the east coast of the United States in the early 1830s. And as a result, you see cemeteries in the Northeast like Mount Auburn in Boston, Laurel Hill in Philadelphia, and Greenwood in Brooklyn. And Glenwood is kind of the Texas continuation of that trend. One interesting note is that in some cities, not in Boston, Philadelphia, or New York, but certainly in Houston, these rural cemeteries predated public parks. So for Glenwood's first 30 years of existence, we were the closest, or Glenwood was the closest thing that Houston had to a public park. So Victorian Houstonians would have used the grounds not only as a cemetery, but also as a place to picnic, to take walks, to take Sunday drives. This is an engraving that gives you an idea of what the grounds looked like in the 1880s. And Glenwood is still a wonderful place to do that. It is not only a cemetery, but it also still feels very much like a park. Over the last 150 years, Glenwood has become one of America's premier examples of a garden cemetery. It's an outdoor sculpture garden. It's the resting place of scores of fascinating people, and you can visit the cemetery on your own. It's open every day. But I encourage you, if you want to really learn more about the history and the people who were buried there, take one of Preservation Houston's walking tours of Glenwood. We offer them several times a year, and you can learn more at preservationhouston.org/tours. The tours are not just a rehash of what you're hearing in these Zoom sessions. We cover a lot more material on the tours, and of course, you get to see it in person. And on that note, I want to thank Dick and Glenwood for their long-term partnership with Preservation Houston that has allowed us to offer these tours for quite a few years now and show off one of the most beautiful places in town. So this morning, we're going to be looking at the stories of some of the people at Glenwood who were involved in oil in Houston. Now, as you would expect, there are quite a few oil people who are buried at Glenwood. I'm going to run through a few of them quickly here, and then we'll kind of get into the featured folks. But if you start looking at the people buried at Glenwood, you'll find groups like the founders of Humble Oil, which is today's Exxon Mobil. It's a group that includes W.S. Farish, R.L. Blaffer, Harry Wise, and Ross Sterling. Sterling also served as governor of Texas from 1931 to 1933, but these men were among the group that founded Humble back in the early years of the 20th century. And of course, we know Exxon has grown to become one of the biggest oil producers in the world. There's also Robert Alonzo Welch, an oil man who left a $25 million trust that supported chemical research in Texas when he died in 1952. Roy Huffington, one of the more recent generations of oil men, a geologist and oil producer who may be best known for pioneering the use of liquefied natural gas. And Huffington's interesting to me because, you know, a lot of times when you think of Texas oil men, you kind of think of cowboy hat and boots, but Huffington did some things that sort of buck that trend. He was known for his leadership of the Rothko Chapel, the Salzburg Global Seminar, and he served as U.S. ambassador to Austria in the early 1990s. And although the colorful oil man Hugh Roy Cullen is not at Glenwood, which is why he has an asterisk by his name there, his descendants, the Robertson family, are at Glenwood. Now, Cullen's oil discoveries made him one of the richest men in the world virtually overnight, and one of the ways that he used his fortune was to support the young University of Houston. And the Robertson family has continued that tradition. H.R. Cullen's daughter, Wilhelmina, was a U of H alumna and a longtime director of the Cullen Foundation, and her husband, Corbin Robertson, whose day job was with the Cullen Oil Company, was a major supporter of U of H athletics. He helped to recruit top coaches to the university that led to the powerhouse Cougar football and basketball teams of the late 60s and 70s. So you'll find the Robertsons in Glenwood. And I could spend more time on any of those stories, and maybe I'll get to in some future program. But for today, I want to focus on three people who really made their marks on Houston oil in different ways, and people who we still can learn from and talk about today. The first being Joseph Cullinan. He was a man whose career began before oil was discovered in Texas. And his oil-related work ended up bringing him here and making him kind of what I consider to be Texas's first modern oil man. But to start Cullinan's story, we go back to his native Pennsylvania. He was born near a town called Sharon, Pennsylvania in 1860. And the first oil well in the world had been drilled about 60 miles from Sharon in 1859, the year before Cullinan was born. So that part of Pennsylvania became one of the first centers of oil production anywhere in the world. Cullinan went to work in the Pennsylvania oil fields when he was 14, and he spent the rest of his teens learning his way around the business. In the early 1880s, when Cullinan was 22, he took a job with Standard Oil, which at the time was the dominant oil company in the U.S. You can see this cartoon showing Standard Oil as an octopus that has its tentacles wrapped around pretty much every aspect of American power at the time. Cullinan worked his way up to managerial positions in Standard, and he struck out on his own at age 35 by founding the Petroleum Iron Works, which was a company that made steel storage tanks for oil. So then we come to Texas. In 1894, the year before Cullinan launched his tank company in Pennsylvania, Oil was discovered in Texas, but it was not on the Gulf Coast. The discovery was made in Corsicana, south of Dallas, and it led to a mini oil boom up there. The problem was that there just wasn't much demand for oil in Texas in the 1890s. There was some use for it in the cities, but we didn't have automobiles that used gasoline. There were few engine related things. Texas was really an agricultural state, and farmers just didn't need oil at the time. On top of that, there was an oil refinery in Texas, but it was at Sour Lake, not far from Beaumont. And Corsicana is a good ways away from there. And there was no easy way to transport the oil from Corsicana to be refined at Sour Lake. So the upshot of this was oil kept coming out of the ground in Corsicana, but nobody knew what to do with it. So a lot of it just ended up being dumped on the ground. And finally, in 1897, after 3 years of this, the folks in Corsicana decided to call in Joseph Cullinan to advise them. So he thought there was a lot of potential. He agreed to buy 150,000 barrels of oil at 50 cents a barrel. And then he announced plans to build a refinery and storage tanks and to find a local market for the Corsicana oil. He wouldn't be able to get any support from local investors because they didn't think oil was ever going to be a thing in Texas. So he got financing from out of state, and he ended up increasing production in the Corsicana field from 1,450 barrels a year when he arrived to more than 839,000 in 1900. His refinery and storage system more than doubled the price of Corsicana crude from 50 cents a barrel in 1897 to $1.10 in 1900. And if you're wondering about who he found to purchase this oil, some of it went to cities. He sold it to railroads for locomotive fuel, and he also sold it to local governments to help settle the dust on dirt roads, which is something that nobody had thought of before. And of course, by 1900, we were starting to get gas-powered automobiles, and so that was a real growth industry. One of Cullen's operations at Corsicana, I should mention, became Magnolia Petroleum, which later grew into part of Mobil, which is now ExxonMobil. So everything kind of comes back to Exxon. And if you're familiar with Dallas, you've probably seen the iconic Pegasus sign on the former Magnolia Petroleum building downtown. The Pegasus was the symbol of Magnolia and Mobil. Now, when oil was discovered at Spindletop in southeast Texas in 1901, Cullinan moved his operations down there, and he formed a couple of companies. One of them dealt in kerosene and another focused on oil exploration before he launched the Texas Company in 1902 to refine and transport oil. And the Texas Company was the one that turned out to be the big success. Within a few years, Cullinan moved the company's headquarters to Houston. This is their first office building in Beaumont on the left and their first office building in Houston on the right. And it became the first major oil company to locate in Houston. Over the next decade, Cullinan continued drilling oil wells across southeast Texas. He built pipelines to connect the oil fields with Port Arthur, where the crude oil was refined and shipped. And by 1912, the Texas Company was selling oil coast to coast, and its assets were around $60 million. The company began work on a new headquarters building in Houston at the corner of San Jacinto and Rusk downtown, designed by Warren and Wetmore, the same architects who designed Grand Central Terminal in New York. Everything was going really well for Cullinan until the day that it wasn't. Part of his success was built on funding that he got from New York investors. And as Texaco got bigger, the New York investors started to think that Cullinan was too big for his britches. One of the investors complained, "He looks upon us here in New York as the tail of the dog, and a very small tail at that." So the New Yorkers decided to move the company headquarters to New York in 1913, and Cullinan resigned in protest. And the Texas Company continued growing. It had always been nicknamed Texaco, but it officially changed its name to Texaco in 1959. Cullinan retained an interest in Texaco for the rest of his life, but he never led the company again. But that wasn't the end of Cullinan. He formed a new company, Farmers Oil, after he left Texaco. Farmers grew into a holding corporation called American Republics, and it increased in value from $30,000 in 1916 to $74 million 10 years later. At the company's height, Cullinan built the Petroleum Building at the corner of Texas and Austin downtown, which was a skyscraper that was designed to house a variety of small oil companies rather than one big oil company. And the building still exists. It's now the Cambria Hotel. Cullinan also became involved in Houston's affairs. He served as president of the Chamber of Commerce. He pushed for expansion of the ship channel, and he also headed up the construction of a railroad near the new port of Houston. He developed a residential neighborhood, which was something that some of Houston's wealthy were doing at the time. His was called Shady Side, and it's the gated neighborhood that's just north of Rice University at the corner of Main and Sunset. Now, the final chapter in Cullinan's life was one of public service. During World War I, he was an advisor to Herbert Hoover, who you see here. And at the time, Hoover was head of the United States Food Administration, which was the agency that was charged with administering the American military's food reserves. Now, you might not have heard of the Food Administration, but you probably have heard of one of its slogans, which is "Food will win the war." Or you might know one of its rationing inventions, Meatless Mondays, which was encouraging Americans to conserve meat. So they had posters like this trying to convince you that you should eat a pound of cottage cheese instead of eating delicious meat. I am not completely convinced, but it's wartime. You do what you have to do. After the war, Cullinan and Hoover worked again to help rebuild Belgian schools that had been damaged during the war. And then in the late 1920s, Cullinan chaired the Mount Rushmore National Memorial Society, which was the group that raised money for construction of the Mount Rushmore Memorial. And Cullinan unveiled the giant bust of George Washington, which was the first one to be completed on July 4th, 1930. Now, I want to take a second to talk about Cullinan's death because it's kind of an odd story. So in March 1937, Cullinan went to California to visit his old buddy Herbert Hoover at his home in Palo Alto. And on the way to Palo Alto, Cullinan stopped overnight in San Francisco. And in the middle of the night, there was an earthquake. And it wasn't a major one, but Cullinan was old enough to remember the big 1906 earthquake that destroyed San Francisco. And he was worried that it was happening again. So he rushed out of his hotel into the street wearing only his pajamas. He caught a cold, which quickly went into pneumonia, and 4 days later, he was dead at age 76. His plot at Glenwood is at the southern end of the cemetery overlooking Memorial Drive and Buffalo Bayou. And his legacy lives on today in the Texas oil business. As I said, I kind of see him as Texas's first modern oil man, and he also helped to build the first market for Texas crude oil. And of course, his work promoting the ship channel and the port of Houston helped to give us the modern day port that we have. There's another aspect to his legacy as well. Part of the land where the Museum of Fine Arts was built was donated by Cullinan. And then years later, his daughter Nina, who we talked about in our first Glenwood Zoom session back in July, donated $250,000 to the museum toward construction of a new wing, which ended up being Mies van der Rohe's Cullinan Hall of 1958, which you see here. Cullinan Hall still exists, but it's now enclosed by the Brown Pavilion, which is another Mies addition that stretches all the way out to Bissonnette. One other note about Cullinan, he had a fiercely independent and conservative streak, and one of the things that he was known for in his day was flying the Jolly Roger flag from the top of the Petroleum Building. In his words, the flag was a warning to privilege and oppression within or without the law, including witch burners and fanatics who fail to realize that liberty is a right and not a privilege. And I think if Cullinan had survived today, maybe he would find a job as a political commentator. Who knows? Now, Joseph Cullinan was famous in his time, but Texas oil stayed largely under the radar, even as the state's huge oil fortune started to take shape in the 1930s. The idea of the Texas big rich oil man didn't hit the national consciousness until two magazines, Life magazine and Fortune magazine, decided to run spreads about oil wealth in the spring of 1948. One historian wrote, "The Life and Fortune articles sent dozens of Eastern writers scurrying into Texas for the first time, many of them eager to advance the stereotype of eccentric nouveau riche Texas zillionaires tossing $100 bills like confetti." And it really did become a media bonanza. Everybody was fascinated by this new breed of super wealthy Texas oil man. And no Texas oil man was willing to fit that stereotype of the nouveau riche guy tossing $100 bills out, quite like Glenn McCarthy, the next person we're going to talk about. McCarthy had a humble childhood. He was born near Spindletop on Christmas Day, 1907, and his dad, Will, was an oil worker in the fields there. So Glenn McCarthy went to work at age 8 for his first job delivering water to the oil fields. The family moved to Houston when Glenn was 10, and for the next few years, he worked a series of odd jobs while he made his way through school. He also made a name for himself as an amateur boxer and a football player. He got a football scholarship to Tulane, and he ended up getting injured and transferring to A&M. He was kicked out of A&M for hazing, and he ended up playing football at Rice and attending college while he worked part-time at a gas station. Around 1930, McCarthy decided to go out on his own, so he talked the regional manager for Sinclair Oil into letting him run a Sinclair station at the corner of Main and McGowan in the South End, what we would now call Midtown. And he kept his station open 24 hours a day. Glenn McCarthy would work at the station for 20 hours every day, and then he hired his dad to cover the other 4 while he was at home asleep. Sinclair was impressed by McCarthy's drive and gave him a second station at Westheimer and Waugh. And before long, McCarthy sold off both of those gas stations to enter the high risk and high reward field of wildcatting, which means basically drilling for oil in places where you might not find it. It was drilling in places that people didn't think were good conditions for oil, or in places where it was thought all the oil had already been extracted. His first wildcat was focused on a place called Strang, which was between Deer Park and LaPorte. He tried drilling twice, and both of his wells were dry. He ended up running through nearly all of his money. After the failed wildcat at Strang, McCarthy decided to hire himself out as a drilling contractor. So he wouldn't initiate the drilling himself, but he would drill for other people. He was known for being quick and budget conscious, in part because he often paid his crews with IOUs, and he drilled with equipment that he borrowed from nearby drilling sites in the middle of the night. And it's worth mentioning here who Glenn McCarthy's in-laws were, because that's a big part of the story. McCarthy was married to Faustine Lee, who was the daughter of oilman William Lee. And you can see McCarthy and Faustine on the left and then William Lee on the right. McCarthy met the 16-year-old Faustine when she pulled into his gas station, and they went out on a few dates and then eloped. McCarthy later said that he had $1.50 to his name when he met Faustine, but he vowed that he would never take $1 of Lee money. And I don't know if he kept that promise, but he was willing to use Lee family connections, if not to take actual dollars from the Lees. So William Lee made introductions that led McCarthy to work for cotton broker M.D. Anderson, who was drilling for oil near Conroe, and geologist Michelle Halbooty, who had a lease on a plot of land near Beaumont. And this is a picture of McCarthy on the left and Halbooty together in Halbooty's office. The Halbooty lease story is an interesting one. When Halbooty brought McCarthy on, no drilling had taken place yet on the lease, and if work didn't begin soon, then the lease was going to expire in a matter of days. So McCarthy got his equipment in place by 11 p.m. on the day before the lease expired. So basically he had 1 hour to save the lease, but he couldn't get his machinery started. So he told his crew that they were going to have to start drilling by hand, which nobody did at the time. They sank a drill bit at 11:45 p.m., and so work was officially done, the lease was saved, and a week later they struck oil. It was the beginning of a string of oil strikes. There were 38 in the next 7 years that netted McCarthy $2 million. And he had some false starts after that, but he ended up becoming one of the most prolific wildcatters around. He increased his fortune to about $50 million by the mid-1940s. Now, after World War II, McCarthy started planning something big. He had a vision for an office, hotel, and shopping complex that was inspired by Rockefeller Center in New York. The Houston version of this was going to be called McCarthy Center, and McCarthy envisioned that it would be anchored by the world's finest hotel. And in the end, the hotel ended up being the only part of this complex that was built. It was the Shamrock, an 18-story, 1,100-room property at the corner of Main and Holcomb that cost an extravagant $21 million to build and was decorated in 63 shades of green inside as a nod to McCarthy's Irish heritage. The hotel's opening night party on St. Patrick's Day 1949 was legendary. Outside, tens of thousands of people gathered to get a glimpse of Hollywood stars that McCarthy had brought in for the occasion, while inside, a crowd of more than 3,000 people jammed into receptions and dinners that had been planned for 2,000. They had sold 2,000 tickets and somehow 3,000 people showed up. Chaos ensued, which was helped along by an open bar, and NBC was planning to broadcast the festivities live coast to coast on the radio, but they ended up having to pull the plug on their broadcast. The show got on the air 30 minutes late, and when it finally went live, all listeners heard for a while was just kind of crowd noise and chaos in the room because the broadcasters actually couldn't get to the microphone because the place was so crowded. The connection went haywire shortly after that, and what listeners heard at home was a live feed from the control room where all the technicians were just cursing like crazy, so NBC decided to pull the plug on that. Houston Post columnist George Furman wrote that the night combined the most exciting features of a subway rush, Halloween in a madhouse, and a circus fire, which is a pretty good description. Despite that opening night bedlam, the Shamrock was a huge hit, or maybe because of the opening night bedlam. Locals and tourists booked rooms, people crowded the dining rooms and nightclubs, There was a synchronized swimming team that performed in the enormous outdoor pool, and ABC Radio began Saturday at the Shamrock, which was a weekly program based at the hotel. The Shamrock quickly became shorthand for mid-century Texas oil wealth. One San Antonio journalist wrote, "Most Americans think of Houston as a cluster of mud huts around the Shamrock Hotel, in the cellars of which people hide from the sticky climate, emerging at long intervals to scatter $1,000 bills to the four winds." Up in Dallas, they took to calling the hotel the Dam Rock, which tells me that we must have been doing something right. McCarthy looked like he was riding high when the Shamrock opened, but everything wasn't as it seemed. In those days, there were Eastern financiers who were eager to lend money to Texas oil men because it seemed like everything they touched turned to gold. And most Texas oil men would not accept the loans because they said, well, we don't need them. McCarthy was another story. He took one of the biggest loans, $51.8 million, from the Equitable Life Assurance Society of New York, part of which went toward his considerable debts and part of which went to build the Shamrock. And the Equitable felt like even lending $51 million to one person, nearly $52 million, was a safe bet because McCarthy was going to strike oil again and the Shamrock could not possibly fail. The truth was, the Shamrock lost money from day one. It was too big and too opulent, and even when it ran at full capacity, it didn't turn a profit. And on top of that, McCarthy favored a lavish lifestyle, and his spending didn't show any signs of slowing down. And by the way, after the Shamrock opened, he kind of took to dressing in the Hollywood style, so you would see him in these more casual clothes. He wore dark glasses all the time and usually had a big cowboy hat on. One example of his spending was his house, which was called Glenlee. It was a 3-story Southern colonial mansion that he built at the corner of Kirby and Braeswood in 1938. And newspapers reported that the cost of the house was $200,000, but word on the street was all in, it had cost McCarthy closer to $700,000. And either of those figures, $200,000 or $700,000, would have been a fortune in 1938. Now, McCarthy claimed that he was worth as much as $200 million when the Shamrock opened in the spring of 1949. But when the Equitable looked into the value of his oil reserves that summer, they found that the actual figure was closer to $60 million. And that didn't worry him so much because that was enough to cover his debt to the Equitable. It wasn't enough to cover his debt to other people, but they weren't too concerned about that. McCarthy promised that he would take care of things by building a new chemical plant and developing a new oil field, but he couldn't find funding for those ventures because his investors were starting to get skittish when they found out he was worth $60 million and not $200 million. What's more, it pretty quickly came out that McCarthy had inflated the value of some of his natural gas fields. So the Equitable took another look at McCarthy's finances in early 1950, and they found that his assets were actually worth about $20 million, not $60 million, and certainly not $200 million. The directors of the Equitable decided that that was enough. They booted McCarthy from leadership of his companies. He eventually turned all of his stock over to the Equitable in exchange for an annual allowance and a suite at the Shamrock. And the company sold off his holdings, including the hotel, which became a Hilton property in 1954. McCarthy spent the next few years trying to build a natural gas business in Bolivia, which he thought was going to make another fortune for him, but that didn't work out. He came back to Houston and took a turn as a nightclub operator, which also didn't work out. He sold his mansion to developer Harold Farb in 1972, and then he moved to LaPorte, where he kind of faded from public view. And one of the things about McCarthy was he was really good at making news. And so when he kind of got out of the public eye and wasn't in the news anymore, a lot of people sort of stopped thinking about him day to day. So it was a real surprise when the Texas Medical Center in the mid 1980s acquired the Shamrock and announced plans to tear the hotel down. A protest was held, and who should show up but Glenn McCarthy, who was by then nearly 80 years old. That was the last time that most people saw McCarthy. A month after the Shamrock closed in the summer of 1986, McCarthy's kidneys gave out. He had an extended hospital stay and then was moved to a nursing home where he spent his last few months. And he died on December 26, 1988, the day after his 81st birthday. It turned out that he outlived the Shamrock by 18 months. The hotel was demolished in June of 1987. McCarthy was buried in the Lee family plot at Glenwood, which is also where his sister-in-law, the actress Jean Tierney, is buried. And if you watched our session on Glenwood women back in July, you may remember that Jean Tierney was married to Faustine Lee's brother, Howard. So they're all in the family plot there. Now, there are fewer and fewer Houstonians around who remember McCarthy in his heyday, but even those who know nothing about him may be familiar with parts of his life, including the Shamrock's raucous opening party, because they're paralleled in Edna Ferber's story Giant, which started as a novel and became a hit movie. Edna Ferber's character, Jet Rink, has a lot in common with Glenn McCarthy, including being a flamboyant oil man and building a big hotel and having a blowout party when it opened. You see James Dean on the right playing Jet Rink in the 1956 movie. Now, I should note both Edna Ferber and Glenn McCarthy insisted that there was no resemblance whatsoever between Jet Rink and Glenn McCarthy, but one writer said, "It's about as difficult to identify the character in Giant as it would be to recognize the Washington Monument if it were painted purple." I want to close out Glenn McCarthy's story with a quote from Texas Monthly. The magazine ran an essay in 1986 using the Shamrock's demolition as a metaphor for a rapidly evolving Texas. And I think it's a good summary of how things had changed since McCarthy's heyday. And looking back on it, this essay from the mid 80s really kind of was a sign of things to come in Texas. So Gregory Curtis, Texas Monthly's longtime editor, wrote this. He said, "The sleek and functional will replace the gaudy. The postdoctoral fellow will replace the wildcatter. The lab coat will replace the hard hat. Money will be spent with less flamboyance, and the world will find less and less about Texas to mock. All of that is for the better, and who has not longed for all of that to come about? But now that the time is here, now that the inevitable events are beginning, there's no pleasure in watching the monuments to our gaudy but effervescent past get bulldozed into submission." And I think that's the way that a lot of people felt about the Shamrock. It was maybe never the most beautiful building in town, but it was certainly a reminder of a time that's gone by and an era that we just don't have anymore. Now, I want to wrap up today by talking about maybe the most famous oil-related person at Glenwood, which is a little bit ironic because he technically wasn't an oil man himself, although his family fortune was based in the oil field. It's Howard Hughes, the eccentric billionaire who's also probably the most famous person buried at Glenwood, period. And I should say as we begin, there's so much rumor and legend that is built up around Howard Hughes that it can be tough to separate fact from fiction in his story, but I'm going to do my best. Hughes was born on Christmas Eve, 1905. He was the only child of Howard Hughes Sr., who you see here. Howard Sr. made his fortune with a rotary drill bit that revolutionized oil drilling. Hughes Sr. had gotten involved in oil after the Spindletop discovery in 1901, but his big break came in 1909 when he patented what was officially called the Sharp Hughes rock bit, but it was informally known as the Rock Eater. And you can see the patent for that drill bit on the left. The key to the Rock Eater was those two interlocking cones that would pulverize whatever they came into contact with, and that allowed oil wells to be drilled deeper, more easily than ever before. Now, most historians agree that Howard Hughes Sr. did not actually invent this drill bit. It was based on plans that several other people had come up with, but his real triumph was patenting the design and then figuring out how to manufacture it. And interestingly enough, most of his money didn't come from manufacturing the drill bit. It came from licensing the drill bit, which was used in oil fields around the world. So what was originally the Sharp Hughes Tool Company, later Hughes Tool, didn't sell the drill bit. You would just pay them to use it to drill your oil well. You'd return it and somebody else would use it, which was genius. Howard Hughes Jr. was an interesting kid with an interesting mind. His dad wanted him to become an engineer, so he indulged Howard's interest in anything mechanical. Howard Jr. built Houston's first radio transmitter when he was 11 using parts that he took from the Hughes' doorbell, and he became one of the first licensed radio operators in town. This would have been in the mid-teens, around the time of World War I. The next year at age 12, he built a sort of primitive motorbike with parts that he took from a steam engine, and you can see him with the bike there on the right. But his childhood wasn't necessarily a happy one. His dad was always off doing business-related things, and his mother, Aline, doted on him. Remember, he was an only child. She had had a difficult pregnancy and delivery, and the doctor told her, you really shouldn't have any more children. So I think she focused all of her energy on Howard. She's said to have had a real fear of disease, especially flu and polio, and it's understandable because both of those could have been fatal back then. She wouldn't let Howard associate with neighborhood kids, partly because she didn't want him to bring germs home, and partly because I think she was just sort of, for lack of a better word, kind of jealous and overprotective, I guess. She would take Howard and flee Houston at the first sign of a local outbreak of some illness, which is thought to have contributed to his fear of germs later in life. She constantly talked about what a shy kid Howard was and how he didn't have any friends, which basically ensured that he was shy and didn't have any friends. One biographer of Howard Hughes wrote, if Howard had no inherent anxieties as a small boy, then he certainly had them by the time he reached adolescence. He was sent off to school in California when he was in his teens, and while he was away, his mother died suddenly, and Howard Sr. persuaded his sister in law, Annette Gano, to take care of Howard Jr. So Howard Sr. and Annette moved to California. Although Howard Jr. went on to attend Caltech and then come back to Houston to go to Rice, Howard Sr. avoided coming back to Houston as much as he could. He said it was just too painful to be here because every time he was in the city, he would be reminded of his wife. He did have to come back to Houston from time to time for business meetings. And during one of those trips in January of 1924, he dropped dead of a heart attack. So Howard Hughes lost both of his parents within a couple of years. Howard Hughes Sr. left Howard Jr. 75% of the Hughes Tool Company, with the other 25% going to Howard Sr.'s parents and his brother. So that left Howard Jr. an orphan at age 18 and a millionaire many times over. He had had this sheltered childhood, which left him suspicious of other people, and that extended to his family. He began to suspect that they were out to get their hands on his money. So he bought out his grandparents' and his uncle's shares of Hughes Tool to secure complete ownership for himself, and then he basically withdrew from the family. Some of his relatives never got over it. When his grandmother died in 1928, she left a will that read in part, I mention the name of my grandson, Howard R. Hughes Jr., to show that I have not forgotten him and that I purposely have not given him anything. Now, Hughes had himself declared an emancipated minor at age 19, which meant that he could take full control of his estate and Hughes Tool. Not long after that, he married a Houston socialite named Ella Rice and moved to Los Angeles to try his hand at filmmaking. He had gotten interested in the movies through his uncle Rupert, who was a screenwriter and movie director. So Hughes financed a series of hit movies, including Two Arabian Nights in 1927, starring Mary Astor and William Boyd, and then 1930's Hell's Angels, which was a World War I epic that made a star out of Jean Harlow. And it was in this movie, by the way, that Jean Harlow delivered a line which everybody knows, but everybody misquotes. Her line in Hell's Angels was, would you be shocked if I put on something more comfortable? And I think it's usually quoted now as, would you mind if I slipped into something more comfortable? But that's where that came from. Ella Rice walked out on Howard Hughes during the filming of Hell's Angels. He was away from home for days on end working on the movie. And even though he hung out with the Hollywood crowd, he refused to let Ella associate with the Hollywood people. They divorced. And at that point, Howard largely wrote off his mother's side of the family, just as he had done with his father's side. He continued making movies and attracted his share of controversy. You may be familiar with the 1943 film The Outlaw, which was Jane Russell's breakout picture. The film was released twice and it was censored twice, and I think the poster speaks for itself here, but it got a huge amount of publicity along the way, and it was a big hit everywhere it was shown. Now, during his time in Hollywood, Howard Hughes became romantically linked with a number of movie stars, including Katharine Hepburn, Bette Davis, Rita Hayworth, Ava Gardner, Ginger Rogers, the list goes on and on. He was actually briefly engaged to Ginger Rogers around 1940, but she broke things off when she found out that he was seeing two other women at the same time. So he was very much living up to his reputation as a Hollywood playboy, I guess. Although the movie making continued, Howard Hughes's focus had shifted by the early 1930s to another of his passions, which was aviation. He took his first plane ride when he was 15 in a Curtiss seaplane, and the experience stuck with him. He was just always fascinated with flight. And somewhere in his life, he not only learned how to fly, it's suspected that he might have taken flying lessons as a teen, but nobody knows for sure. But he also picked up an intimate understanding of the mechanics of modern airplanes. Now, some of his biographers think that he skipped Hollywood for a few months in 1931 to take a job as a co-pilot for American Airlines using the alias Charles Howard. And again, nobody knows if that's true, but he did kind of disappear for a while, and then he came back and was really gung-ho about planes. Whatever the case was, Hughes established a new business called the Hughes Aircraft Company in 1932. He handpicked a team of engineers and designers, and he told them that his goal was to build the world's fastest plane, and money was no object. The first model that they turned out was this one, the Hughes H-1 in 1935. It was full of innovations, including aerodynamic wings, a streamlined design, and retractable landing gear, which had never appeared on a plane before. The H-1 was extremely fast. In speed trials that were flown by Howard Hughes himself, the average speed was 352 miles an hour, which was well over the world record of 314 miles an hour. And the H-1 actually broke the transcontinental speed record in 1937 by a full 2 hours. It made the trip from Los Angeles to New York in 7 hours and 28 minutes. Hughes Aircraft produced other notable airplanes too, including the H-4 Hercules, which we know as the Spruce Goose. The War Department commissioned the H-4 in 1942 as a troop transport plane. It was the largest plane in the world, and it had the longest wingspan at 320 feet of any plane built until 2019. The Spruce Goose nickname referred to the fact that the plane was almost completely built out of wood because of wartime material restrictions, but it wasn't spruce, it was birch, but I guess birch goose didn't have the same ring to it. The H-4 was not finished until after the war ended, and it only flew once. It went about a mile at an altitude of around 70 feet. A lot of people said it was this boondoggle and that it wouldn't even fly, so Howard Hughes proved them wrong by flying it a little bit. Then he put it in storage. The plane never took off again, but Hughes had a crew of 300 to maintain it in perfect condition. And today, the Spruce Goose is displayed in McMinnville, Oregon. And I should mention the H-1, the last plane that I talked about, you can see today at the Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. There was also the XF-11, which was a prototype military reconnaissance plane. Howard Hughes was taking it on a test flight over Los Angeles in 1946 when the plane developed a hydraulic leak, and Hughes tried to land on a golf course, but he ended up crashing into a home in Beverly Hills. And if you've seen the movie The Aviator, you'll remember that this crash is included in that movie. Hughes was severely injured in the crash. Although he recovered, he had a scar on his upper lip, and so he wore a mustache for most of the rest of his life to hide that scar. Now, it's worth mentioning here, while Howard Hughes was laid up in the hospital at death's door, he became dissatisfied with the hospital bed that he was in. So he designed a new hospital bed in 6 sections that could be independently controlled by electric motors. And he never ended up using his hospital bed, but elements of it are still used in the hospital beds that we have today. Just to give you an idea of what kind of an inventor he was. Now, what Howard Hughes is probably best known for these days is not the movie making or the aeronautics or the inventions, but rather the later part of his life, which he spent in increasing seclusion. He never liked being in the public eye. His upbringing, of course, as we said, led him to a fear of disease and germs. He started showing signs of an obsessive compulsive disorder in the 1930s, and he had 2 nervous breakdowns in the 40s. By 1950, Hughes had stopped nearly all of his public appearances, and the last official photograph of him, which you see here, was taken in 1957. He began insisting that everybody around him cover their hands with 6 to 8 layers of Kleenex before they touched anything that he was going to touch. And this was the time when he also stopped cutting his hair and fingernails. And we now think that that may have been the result of a nerve condition called allodynia that makes everyday things like cutting your hair, cutting your fingernails, even putting on clothes incredibly painful. Allodynia can be caused by nerve damage sustained at an accident, and we know Howard Hughes had several airplane crashes, so it's entirely possible that that was the case. Now, in the midst of all this, Hughes just kept getting richer. Hughes Tool and Hughes Aircraft were both profitable ventures, and Howard Hughes owned interest in major companies including RKO Studios and TWA, the airlines. His net worth in the mid-1940s was north of $500 million. And in the 1950s, that climbed to more than $1 billion and just kept going from there. He invested in real estate and Las Vegas casinos, mining operations. He expanded Hughes Aircraft to include defense systems, helicopters, and the world's first geosynchronous communications and weather satellites. And for a good bit of this period, in spite of his quirks, the fact that he was becoming a recluse and wasn't going out in public, you may be surprised to learn that he was married to his second wife, the actress Jean Peters. They married in 1957, and they were together until 1966 when Howard Hughes decided to leave California to move to Las Vegas, and he did so without telling his wife, which is going to cause trouble. They divorced officially in 1971, and Jean Peters took an annual alimony of $70,000, but she waived any claim to Hughes's estate, and she never spoke publicly about their marriage. There was a newspaper columnist named Jack Anderson who said he thought that Peters was the only woman who Howard Hughes ever actually loved. So Hughes left Las Vegas for the Bahamas around 1970. Then he moved to Nicaragua in 1972, apparently to avoid taxes. He was there for a few months before he moved to London and then apparently back to the Bahamas. And he might have remained in the Bahamas for the rest of his life, or he might have moved from the Bahamas to Acapulco. But one of the kind of fascinating things from our perspective in 2021 is in the early 1970s, no one really knew where the world's richest man was. And you can see from these headlines, it was always a guessing game where he was and what he was doing. What we do know is that Howard Hughes died on April 5th, 1976, reportedly aboard an airplane that was headed to Houston from Acapulco. The cause of death was initially listed as a stroke, but eventually they decided it was kidney failure that was brought on by large doses of aspirin. He took 20 to 30 aspirin tablets a day, combined with dehydration. When Hughes's body arrived at Methodist Hospital in Houston, he was 6'1" and weighed 93 pounds. And remember, no one had really seen him since the 1950s. The last photograph of him was the one I showed you from 1957. The body that arrived at Methodist was so unrecognizable that the staff had to send fingerprints to the FBI to confirm that the person they had was actually Howard Hughes. He was buried with his parents in their plot at Glenwood, and I talked about the design of this plot, which was built in the 1920s for Allen and Howard Hughes Sr. Last month in the Monuments program. Now, as I said, most people's idea of Howard Hughes these days centers on his eccentricity, and that's been helped along by plenty of rumors, some really sensational biographies, and I'll put biographies in quotes because many of them, frankly, are made up. And of course, the 2004 movie, The Aviator, which got a lot right, but necessarily condensed the story and left some things out as well. The story of his later life does make for good tabloid fodder, but it overshadows the fact that he was brilliant, I think. It really makes you wonder what he might have done if it weren't for the demons that plagued him for much of his life. Now, what's not clear in all of this is whether all the attention, all the women, all the money ever made Howard Hughes really happy. He wasn't the type to really talk about things like that publicly, but there is one quote of his that I think gives some insight into his mindset. He said this: "The trouble with my life is that I don't think I'm cut out to sit behind a desk. I would probably be much happier if I were a pilot working for some small airline simply trying to do my job as well as possible. But of course, such a thing could never happen because when you become wound up in the web of industry to the extent that I am, unfortunately, you just can't resign the way that you can from a country club." So, on that note, feeling a little bit sorry for Howard Hughes, I'll invite Dick to come back on and close us out, and then we will get to the Q&A.
Thank you, Jim. That was a very informative program that you put on, and I learned a few things that I never really realized about Howard Hughes and about Glenn McCarthy. So, anyhow, thank you. Before we close out and have a question and answer session that can cover any topic about Glenwood, I wanted to share just a few more thoughts with you about our new Center for Glenwood that I talked about a little before Jim came on. I want to describe the facility to you. It's going to be 14,000 square feet. It's going to have an assembly room with kitchen facilities. It'll have an archive and genealogy room, a large reception area, and adequate parking. In connection with that, the development of a new center, we built a new maintenance facility, which is where the new center is going to be. We moved it over to the west side of Glenwood behind the postal facility. And that is a state-of-the-art facility. It covers about 1.25 acres and has about 13,000 square feet of covered maintenance buildings. That facility will last Glenwood for I think probably forever. But anyway, it's really a very for a maintenance facility, you would like it. And finally, we were pleased to be breaking ground very soon for the new Center for Glenwood. We plan on doing that in mid-October. And again, I invite you to call to learn more about how you might get involved with that. We have several ways to recognize our generous donors, and there are several naming opportunities that are still available. And we don't want you to miss out on this once in a lifetime opportunity that will be recognized in perpetuity. In the meantime, thank you for joining us. I would be pleased to answer any questions you have during our Q&A session. And Jim, I'm going to turn that back over to you. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks, Dick, and thanks to everybody for sticking with us here. We are more than happy to take your questions. So again, use the Q&A feature, or you can type them in the chat box if that's easier. But we'd love to hear what's on your mind. And here's a note that's come in from Diane Hillman about Howard Hughes. This is a good point, Diane. I'm glad that you mentioned this. She points out that the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, which was the medical research organization that he founded in the early 1950s, Diane points out it may have been initially founded as a tax write-off or a haven to hide his personal wealth, which is probably true, but it's the second wealthiest philanthropic organization in the U.S. and the second best endowed medical research foundation in the world. And there is some good from that. And it's true. He started the Medical Research Institute to try to, his mandate to them was try to find a cure for all disease, which they're still working on. But he transferred ownership of Hughes Aircraft to the Medical Research Institute, which certainly did lighten his tax burden. He really didn't like taxes. And after his death, the Institute sold off Hughes Aircraft and got this fantastic endowment from the sale of that. So they are doing fantastic work. Dick, we've got a question for you that I'm surprised nobody has asked before. Julie wants to know, how did you get involved with Glenwood?
Oh, Julie, it was quite by accident. I'm a CPA. I don't practice anymore, but the president of Glenwood, chairman of the board, about 40 years ago was a man by the name of Carrington Weems, who is still with us. I was his tax accountant and CPA, and he asked me one day whether I would be interested in taking on Glenwood as a client in terms of overseeing the management and investments and accounting and just oversee the operations. And I agreed and accepted that, not knowing one thing about a cemetery. And after a period of time, it turned out that that's what I'd rather do in life. Would be, there's two things certain: death and taxes. And I've already done the tax part of it. Now I'm going to do the death part of it. So anyway, I'm glad it happened, and I'm proud to enjoy my 39th year here coming up. So anyway, thank you for asking the question.
Is it easier to run a cemetery than to do people's taxes, or? That's my question on top of Julie's question.
Is it easier? I would say tax work can be taxing, but running a cemetery, particularly Glenwood, when I took the reins of Glenwood about almost 40 years ago, there was a lot of things that needed to be done, and what intrigued me about it was the development aspect of it. And over a course of those 38 years, Glenwood has been transformed from a 55-acre cemetery to a 88-acre cemetery. And that didn't happen by accident. So, I'm proud of the things that we've been able to accomplish. And it's the things that have been accomplished have helped us want to do a new center for Glenwood, which I talked about earlier during the presentation. Mm-hmm. So that's my story, and I'm going to stick to it.
I've heard a lot of Dick's jokes over the years, but that's the first time I've heard the death and taxes one, which I appreciate. Lee Huber asks, does the design of monuments at Glenwood have to be approved?
Yes.
And how does that work?
We require that the monument company or whoever's doing the monument provide a proof to us here in the office, in which we review to make sure that it's appropriate for Glenwood. But the answer to that question is yes.
And I guess to build on that a little bit, because I think some people know this and some people don't, but when you buy a plot at Glenwood, that that is not including anything that's built above ground. All that is you take care of that on your own. You arrange for it. You arrange for the design. Is that right?
That's correct, yes. I mean, it
Okay.
may be that, there are times where we do what we call a spec lot. It's, kind of like a spec home, but a spec lot. But we'll do a brick surround or do something. And when we sell that space, we'll sell the uh, above ground improvements with it. So that happens occasionally. But,
Mhm.
the cost of doing anything beyond the buying the right to be buried in a particular spot in Glenwood is up to the lot owner or the person doing the buying.
Okay. And I think, that makes me think of something that when we do tours, we run across lots sometimes that have been there for a long time that are full and don't have any markers. And that's just because for whatever reason the family hasn't decided to put markers, I guess.
Well, that's happened. That happens. Doesn't happen today, but back in the early days, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, it was not uncommon for a family, if they had someone pass away, instead of just buying one space, they'd buy 12. It's a 20 by 20, and over a period of time, through generations, they start filling that up. And some families just simply don't put anything out there, and we have that. We have that over at Glenwood. Not it's not often, but you'll find where you'll have quite a large patch of land that doesn't have anything above ground, but has a lot below ground.
Hmm.
And we have, our record keeping is very particular about that and keeping adequate. Our records are really good in terms of identifying who's down there, but without a name above ground. So.
Speaking of records, in the Center for Glenwood, the genealogical aspect of it and the research aspect of it, what materials will be available for people to use in that research? I mean, do you have an idea of that?
Well, we have our old books, which we've had reproduced, which would be available for research. We have a library here, but I would think that we would probably partner with maybe Clayton Library to expand our offerings, if you will.
Hmm.
But particularly the older records, surprisingly, there are really good records starting going back to 1871, and which is unusual for an older cemetery to have that kind of record keeping, that you can still look and see what was going on back then in print. So all of that will be available.
Well, that'll be exciting. I know there's a lot of people who will be able to use that for sure. Um, and what's the, excuse me, what's the timeline? I don't know if ground has been broken on the building, or how's the construction timeline looking?
Well, there's been some preliminary work done. The duct bank utilities have been put in, but the actual building itself will start in mid-October, and we'll be under construction for about 14 months, I'm told. We're moving, I mentioned during the presentation before that we're going to be moving our entryway about 60 feet to the east on Washington Avenue. And we're talking in discussions with Centerpoint to bring all of the utilities underground in Washington Avenue to really enhance the appearance of the front entryway. But we're moving the entryway about 60 feet to the east. And it's going to be we showed it on the list, an expansive entryway where now it's narrow, and you have to say a prayer when you're trying to get out of Glenwood with a traffic whizzing by. So I think, we're going to have a significant improvement in that part of it, but it's going to be beautiful.
And parking, which is a big improvement.
Correct. And one other thing, we're during this interim period of construction, our front gate is going to be closed. and our entryway will be at the back gate on Kane Street. So we'll have a sign up there that will redirect people, but all of that area that exists as you come in the island and so forth is going to be torn down, and the road's going to be rerouted. We will no longer have a land bridge. There'll be some significant changes made to our entryway, which will enhance the appearance of it, and also provide some additional property for sale as burial space. So it's going to be a little suffering in the meantime about the relocation of the entryway, but I think after everything is said and done, people are really going to be pleased with the results.
It's going to be exciting to see that take shape for sure. Diane, who talked about the Howard Hughes Medical Research Institute, also mentions rightly that Joseph Cullinan, who founded Texaco, and R.L. Blaffer, who was one of the founders of Humble, are buried side by side back at the back of the cemetery, which I don't know if that was coincidence or not. Diane points out that maybe they liked each other and maybe they didn't, because they didn't all get along all the time. But it is interesting that there's kind of that row of oilmen back there at the back. And I don't know if it may have just been the time period in which they all bought their plots. But if anybody else has any other questions or comments, then now would be the time to send them in, because okay, we do have one about watching the program later. And yes, the program today is being recorded, and everybody who signed up today will receive an email with a link where you will be able to watch that recording. And I think that we'll probably be able to put in the links to the recordings of the previous two programs as well. So if you missed either of those, you'll be able to look at them again. And I would just mention, as I said at the beginning of the program, a great way to see Glenwood is to come on one of our walking tours. The next one, actually the next two that we have scheduled in November and February, are going to be two halves of our historic Glenwood Cemetery tour. Glenwood, or Houston before oil and Houston after oil. So in November, we'll be talking about folks who mainly were prominent in the 19th century. And then in February, we'll be talking about some of the people I talked about today and some others who were prominent in 20th century Houston. So those are good, two good tours to take to get kind of an overview of the cemetery and get started if you haven't been on those tours before. You can find information at glenwoodcemetery.org or at preservationhouston.org. And Dick, do you have anything to say as we wrap up?
Well, I just want to thank everybody for tuning in today on this beautiful day outside here in Houston, and I hope y'all enjoyed the program. Jim, I want to thank you for doing what you did during the presentation. I thought it was an excellent, and Glenwood is always pleased to be associated with Preservation Alliance in their endeavors here, doing tours and so forth. So thank you, and thank everybody for joining us today.